Okay, so that's now being recorded to everybody. Right, we're going to start off with some introductions. So I'm Dr. Louise Oliver, and I lead practice education here at Bournemouth University in social work. I've got my colleagues here going to be presenting with me. So I've got Dr. Harvey.
So I look after some of the CPD lead programs for social workers and health, and I also work across the MA and BA programs.
I'm Tilia Lenz. I'm a senior lecturer and a CPD framework lead.
I'm Ros. Good morning. My name's Ros Dray. I work as a senior lecturer here at Bournemouth University, supporting the final placement and practice learning programs here for the BA students and the MAs.
Okay, so we would do introductions for everybody here, but obviously there's an awful lot of you, but it's really wonderful that you are here, so thank you. We're now going to share my screen. There we go. I hope everyone can see that. Well, do let me know if you can't see it. Right. So today we're going to be looking at practice education, exploring how to give constructive feedback. We're going to start off with my colleague Orlando and I talking together, and we're going to focus on key aspects within that. And then we're going to move on to my colleagues Ros and Tilia, and they're going to be looking at the relationship and attachment within practice education as part of the constructive feedback. We've also got a Padlet wall that we're going to put up. We're hoping that you'll engage with that. I'm going to put that up in a link. Well, my colleague's going to do that in a second. But for those of you who've got your phones, you can use the QR code here on this screen. If you scan that, it should then be able to pull up and bring out the Padlet wall. And this is a wall which is about engaging with your experiences of engaging with or having constructive feedback. And in that, it's we're hoping to use that as a resource. So again, it's going to go up on this web page so that you can tap into that and use it later on if you want to. So it's got things about tools and experiences, so we can use that to understand this experience together. So I'm going to bring that up as well to show it to you, to allow you a chance to have a look at it. Okay, now you can see a Padlet wall.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what's on there is you can see that we would like you to engage with, and you just click on this cross down here so you can add your thoughts. But what challenges do you face when giving learners and supervisees feedback? What does good feedback look like to you? Share the worst example of feedback you've seen or been given in practice, and share the most helpful example of feedback you have seen or been given in practice. And what feedback models do you find most helpful? That's just a way for you to put in and add in conversations there about that as well, to help us build up an understanding, the picture of constructive feedback for all of you. And then we're going to look at that after the break. We're going to have a short 5-minute comfort break halfway through this so we can swap over PowerPoints and then also have a quick look at this as well. Okay, so that's there for you to start engaging with. Okay, so, and I'm not going to fiddle around with sharing PowerPoints anymore. We're just going to stick to this PowerPoint that we have. Okay, thank you very much. So, as I said, Orlando and I are going to be looking at particular aspects of constructive feedback today before we move on to the relationships work. Orlando and I are particularly going to be focusing upon role modelling, critically reflective practice, mentoring, and also engaging in conversations about feedback. And then we'll move on to more once we've actually done some, we're going to, I wouldn't say role model it, but we're going to give it a go and for you to then feedback and engage with. So what's this all about? And I know I'm speaking to the people who have turned up here, that you engage in constructive feedback and that it's part of your bread and butter. But just want to go back to the notion that being a practice educator, being a supervisor, that's not just about depositing knowledge into people's heads. We know that. It's about developing a learning culture and supporting people develop that growth mindset that's really important. We know that there's different ways that we can do that, and part of that is through constructive feedback, as well as role modelling that critically reflective practice that we know is so essential within social work. It's part of the PCFs, it's part of our domains that we need to follow, and it's, as we know, Social Work England encourage us to do this through our reflective logs that we're encouraged to do every year. So it's a really important thing that we do. And the one way that I like to start doing it when I, as a practice educator, or when I'm engaging with students, social work, adult learners, is I like to, when I first really have a good meeting with them, a supervision, I like to start to talk to them about what their experience of constructive feedback has been like for them. And I try and do that really, really early on, because I think it's important to have that conversation. It also helps you understand and support them in understanding what it looks like and feels like to them, and also for you. So you having that meaningful conversation. And in that, I like to really support and encourage that deep critical reflection about that experience of receiving and giving critical, constructive feedback. Because going deep and supporting that critical reflection from the beginning really helps set expectations and helps the learner or the supervisor understand how far you want to go. What is it going to look like? What does it feel like when you're having this experience? So it's really important to do that, because it helps make the experience transformative in their learning, as well as helps them take a deeper look and an understanding of what's going to work for them. Okay. In addition to this, it's really important that you also seek constructive feedback from them about you as well. And that's from the off. So it's about helping them understand that it's going to be a collaborative process together. Right. Okay, it's going to hand over to Orlando.
So one of the key things about being a practice educator is this is also a leadership role. So you are now stepping into, or have been for a while, in that leadership role. So role modeling is also really an important element. So Louise there was talking about sharing and getting people to share their own experiences of constructive feedback in a supervision. One of the things that could also be really useful here is use of self. And so that's sharing your own ideas about how perhaps you learn, how you've received constructive critical feedback, really getting students and people that you're working with to understand that people are different, that we like it in different, giving it and receiving it in different ways. So one of the key models that we have that helps us think about this kind of relationship, which you might be using with the student, talking to them about how they interact with service users, but I think is also key in this supervisory relationship, is the emotional intelligence model. And looking and particularly focusing on our relationship management skills. So this is the work of Goldman and Morrison, and here we're really focusing on those 4 elements that we have. Our self-awareness, so helping the practice learner, if you like, work through where they're at and their self-awareness themselves of, do they know how they like to receive feedback? Do they know how they respond to feedback? But also having an awareness of this yourself, because you may be very different in your learning style and how you understand feedback for that compared to how they might want it. We then look at our self-management, so that's helping the student to think very much about where they sit and what happens when they receive that feedback, but also again how you're working and interacting with them. And then this interaction moves into the relationship awareness and relationship management, where we're really trying to make a supportive environment for the learner, but also to help the learner themselves understand that this is going to be a two-way dialogue, that you can learn from each other as part of this. Because I think one of the key enjoyable things about being a practice educator is you learn as well, and you learn about people. And some students can be more challenging than others, shall we say, and they're the fun ones. So we're looking at that leadership role, but we're also looking at perhaps, well, then what tools do we have to help the learner think about how they're learning? And I think there's another simple model here that I want to share with you, which can be part of a mentoring relationship, which is comfort, stretch, panic. And this really is a model that can help the student identify where they are in their learning, but can also help the practice educator identify where they are in their learning journey. Because there might be some situations where you're thrown out of stretch and into panic. So Ronka's model is a really good example of where you can have kind of a model of learning that can work from both angles and can be used to help the student think about where they're at. So we don't want the learners in the comfort zone most of the time. We would like them there so that they have an anchor and a base. And my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about some links to attachment theory later on. But what we also really, really want is for them to enter the stretch zone. But the key here is that conversation, because that can be very different for very different people and different learners. But this is an area of novelty and exploration. It's where people really start to engage with that critical thinking and that learning and understanding. But if we push them beyond that into panic, then people stop thinking. We will be in a situation where we might have an emotional hijack. You might see flight, fight, or freeze responses. So it's really worth thinking about exploring this as part of their reflection. And this can happen within supervision if they're asked a question that throws them completely or can be very sensitive. But it can also happen perhaps for them when they're in an interaction with a service user. And therefore, this model can become a really good model of learning to say to them and talk to them about, well, when were you in comfort working with somebody? When did you move into stretch? And then what happened? Where was the panic? And perhaps then talking the learner through and working with them to work out how they can stay in stretch and identify when it's becoming too challenging or too difficult, because they're just not ready for it. It's not saying that they won't get there, but we might need to help them understand when they're in those situations.
So this is a moment when we're going to do a little role play, I guess is the best way of putting it. But we'd really like you to engage in the chat with this. So Orlando's going to be asking me to, engage with that practice that I did last week. And she's going to engage me in a conversation that encouraged me to, as part of the feedback conversation. But we'd really like you in the chat to engage in that and think about the things that worked well, or the things that could be done differently, so that we can learn from that and work through it together. And I don't know where we're going to go with this, because every time we've practiced it, we've ended up in a different place, because it's generally reflecting on practice. Okay.
So just to set the scenario, we're going to think about a group. It's a group facilitated session that Louise ran last week with a co-facilitator. So Lou, obviously I observed that session, so it was a really interesting session. How did you feel it went?
I felt it went well. So the attendees were really engaged and seemed to be really thinking carefully about their experiences and challenging their thinking and understanding about what they'd experienced in their lives. And that was really a joy to watch and be part of.
And so you've been running this program now for 3 weeks,
Yes.
3 or 4 weeks. Is that different from what you saw last week?
Previous week? Yes, so I feel that with several things in happens. One is the attendees are starting to get to know each other and they're getting to know us, but also my confidence in the program and how it works is building. So I find that I'm starting to find my voice with more confidence than I did before.
Okay, so how do you feel about the participants in the group? So you've shared that you thought it went very well, that you were challenging them. How did they feel within the group?
There were times when I would say that they felt that I could see their engagement, but sometimes when there were moments when I saw their body language suddenly shift to not closing down, but kind of an emotional reaction. So there were moments when I felt that they were reacting in a way that I would automatically want to step in and offer well-being. I'm trying not to say rescuing, but I know that's my nature and I have to watch it. So I would want to try and step in rather than allow them to experience that in that moment. So
did you do that at any point?
Yes. Yes, I did. I remember there being a particular moment when I did step in and kind of came in with more of a solutions focused kind of approach to what was happening. And actually, I think what I did was pulled her out of a moment so she couldn't then go any further with her thinking. And I hadn't realised that until you said that. Yeah. Okay.
Tell me more about that.
It's hard sometimes sitting in silence, isn't it? And it's something which I use a lot, but I do struggle with sitting in silence. And I think my nature steps in and I engage and I try and it's that desire to make people feel okay. And actually, sometimes you need to let people sit there and not feel okay. And I know that and I watch myself, but it doesn't mean that there aren't moments where I don't jump in.
What question do you not want me to ask you now?
Am I being truthful to myself? And I'm not sure I'm going to answer that right now.
That's absolutely fine. So thinking about what you've just shared, how might you look at your practice going forward?
Although I know I'm mindful of my nature to step in, and I do my best to work on it, actually I've still got ways to go with it. I still need to continue to work on that and think about, and actually I need to go back to why I'm doing it. And I do have an understanding of why I do it, but maybe I need to go back further. I need to engage into a much deeper understanding of my motivator.
Are you working on your own?
No, I'm not. I've got a co-facilitator who's really awesome. Yeah. So there's something in there as well about engaging with them and also seeing how they're managing the room and the situation. It's not just down to me, which comes back to my other desire to, take responsibility for everything and everyone.
Should we leave it there?
Yeah, let's. Okay. So I hope that was okay, and I hope, people will think what they think, but yeah.
What we'd really like to hear in your chat is things where you felt my questioning technique was clumsy or didn't work or didn't take the student somewhere useful, where you thought there might be moments of reflection. And we generally did do that ad hoc. So it genuinely was a critical reflection on a piece and on something we're project that Louise is involved in at the moment. So we'd just really be interested to see what you thought. And
there are a couple of comments in the chat.
Okay.
From Stanley, there was a great example of reading non-verbal communication that was observed. And Adele has commented, she loved the question, what question do you not want me to ask you right now?
Do you know
and there's a few people that agree with that. Good line of questioning, good open-ended questions. Motivational interviewing techniques, Orlando.
Orlando's very skilled at this. That question about what do I not want, what I didn't want to be asked, that's a really, really good question, because it made me really stop and think, and it's a good one. But what I really respect is the fact that obviously Orlando knew that she wasn't going to ask me to reveal all to people in this moment. It's not a private supervision, but actually I felt it was completely okay to say I'm not going to talk about this right now. And I think I know Orlando would have said, okay, not right now, but when are we going to have a look at this, or how are we going to progress that?
You wouldn't have been allowed to care.
She would have left me. But it really did make me stop and think. And I know what I'm thinking because I do this a lot. But it was really good. So thank you. Okay, right. I'm aware of time, I'm going to move on. So we're now going to be looking at looking more deeply into engaging conversations about feedback. So we need to think about transparency in the assessment process. Now, I really like a model by Stone, which was published in 2018. And it's transparency in the assessment process. And I'm sure many of you have come across it and read it. But Stone talks about the TAPE model, which stands for Transparency of Assessment in Practice Education, but actually it's really relevant for supervisors as well, or anyone who's engaging in any form of assessment or observations, etc. in practice. So I think it's really helpful. Stone talks about the 6 W's. So that's who, when, why, where, way, and what. And they're about the person, you as the practice educator or supervisor, and the supervisee or adult learner, really being clear about all the different stages, or where or why, who's involved in the assessment process. It just really helps engage in a conversation in which you can start to look at any issues, for example, but also so that everyone's really clear about their expectations. It almost makes it smart in that way. So you can really early on start to set that standard and be clear about what's going to be happening. It also helps build up that trusting relationship and helps break down some barriers with the power differentials that happens between supervisor and supervisee, or practice educator and learner. Because we know that's something which we have to really not just be mindful of, but actively work towards managing and lessening that power differential that happens in considering what's happening. And I really like the way how this model really helps encourage the clarity, so that the person who's being observed or assessed doesn't feel like anything's being done in an underhand way or in secrecy. And that's really, really important. We know that in developing that relationship and working with people, that we need to make sure that we're as transparent as we can be. And sometimes I know social work practices have changed in different places, but actually, if you are in the office together or you've gone out on a visit together, and you've observed something and you want to use that as part of a holistic assessment, you're engaging with the person about it, then they need to understand that they can be assessed at any time. And that's actually part of their learning process and part of their journey. But equally, they don't need to feel like they're in Foucault's panopticon, where they are being observed by everybody at all times and feeling quite oppressed by it and fearful and anxious that anything they say, even in their lunch break, could be brought up as part of their assessment. And we know it is in a way that way, you know, anything that can be said, but it's about how we manage that. And actually, Stone's research is really great here because it talks about how actually that the way how we have that conversations, the way how we develop that transparency, the way how we engage in that is through making sure that you have that positive relationship. And, you know, the latter part of this presentation is going to be looking more deeply into relationships, but it really shows that there's that complex variables interacting with one another when we're working with others and when we're supervising others and assessing others. And the research actually shows that perception is really important. So the perception of others, of their learning journey, the learning environment, their relationship with you can have is really key when it comes to their learning journey, their experience, and whether or not there's barriers to their learning. If there's good level of trust, if they feel engaged with and a sense of autonomy to their learning, then we know that there's also going to be research that shows that there's going to be a motivation and a commitment to social work practice in the future. So we know we're not just dealing in the moment, we're not just looking at somebody's journey whilst you're working with them. We obviously know that we want a commitment going forward. We want people to be social workers and family support practitioners and engaging in health and social care. That's really vital. Everyone is vital, and we want people to feel committed to it because they believe in what we're doing and how to make a difference. And in that, what we need to look at is that learning culture. How do we embed a growth mindset and a learning culture, not just within the person that we're working with or our teams, but actually within the agency that we work for? And this is really part of that transparency and how we engage in that feedback. So I'm just going to move on to my last one of my last slides. And it's about a collaborative approach to feedback. And again, I'm using some research, a paper that I expect many of you have come across, Davis and Bedeau in 2015, a paper titled Going Live, a Negotiated Collaborative Model for Live Observation of Practice. And this is a prompt that I'm using because actually the paper talks about observations and there's a lot within it, and I'm going to jump in at a certain point. But there's a point in there which looks at feedback and the feedback process. And I particularly like this model, so I'm going to talk about it. And I use it and I encourage people to use it themselves. And I don't just use this when I'm talking to a learner in practice. I actually try and incorporate this within my written feedback as well when I'm marking assignments, etc. So I really do try and feed this in as much as possible and adapt it when I'm doing this, you know, in feedback and writing. So what I like about it is they separate areas out. So you have the debrief of the observation. So if there's been an observational practice, then you debrief about that and you have a quick conversation. And then it breaks up how the feedback's given. So it starts off with the practitioner or learner to have an opportunity to give their corrective feedback. So that's the things that did not go so well, the areas of development. So that is then given, and it's kept very clear that that's that area. So they get to go first. And the observer or the educator then comes in with their corrective feedback. Again, what they thought didn't go so well, what could be developed, areas of learning, gaps, etc. Then they shift into confirmatory feedback. So then the practitioner or the learner can go in and they start to talk about what went well, their strengths, and all the things that they really felt that stood out for them. And the observer and educator then, after they've spoken, gives their confirmatory feedback. And the bit that I really like about this one as well is there's another stage on from that. And then a reflective discussion is held between the practitioner, learner, or observer and educator. And that's the bit where they show professional curiosity, not just about the observation, but also about the feedback process and the feedback itself. So they start to wander. And I love this notion of wandering. I love wandering with people. So they're showing that curiosity. I wonder when this happened, or when you've observed something and has particularly stood out. So, Sean always talked about how we engage in critical reflection when something unusual has happened, something has stood out. And that's very much about this. You start to wander with them. Well, I'm curious about this. You said this, or I observed this, or when we were having our feedback process, this was said, or I'm just curious. Could you tell me a little bit more about? And if you can use the words of the person as well that they've used, that can create a really powerful way of engaging, talking. It sort of engages in that gestalt. And it's really important to have that conversation and understand it and unpick it in that way. I really love the idea as well of having this as a collaborative approach to feedback. It is a learning journey. We're always on our own learning journey as well. And it also supports and encourages the adult learner or the supervisee to then want to seek out constructive feedback going forwards. It encourages them, it gives them a sense of self and worth and autonomy to go and seek it and keep developing practice. Because we know it's essential that we keep developing our practice understanding. And in that as well, we're learning because we're engaging, seeking feedback ourselves about our practice, what's happened. So we're developing as well. It also helps us, again, look and understand those power differentials and helps us work together in that collaborative way that I think is really essential in practice education and in practice in general. Okay. So I'm just wondering if we should have a quick look at the Padlet wall. Right. Okay. So what challenges do you face when giving learners supervision? We're just going to pull out some key ones for us. So
there's one that really interests me here about somebody who's observed that their student gives one-word answers.
Yes.
Which is an absolute nightmare when you are really digging for some information and you're getting very monosyllabic or one-word answers. So reflecting on that for me, I think, is to start with, maybe think about other ways that they might be able to give or share feedback. So one of the ways that we might use it is to ask them to write you a small poem. Louise and I do work with haikus for reflection. We could think about getting them to draw something, so using metaphor, so maybe they can draw how they're feeling. And I know some of these sounds like things that you might use with service users. Actually, they can be adapted for this kind of learning environment. I saw a lovely one the other day where somebody asked the student to draw around their hand and then on each of the fingers write 5 bits of reflective feedback or things they've learned or taken away from something. So I think for me, if they're finding engaging with conversation really challenging, let's just break open the creative toolkit and see which other ways we can do it. Other things also are to take them out of the environment. So walk and talk, things like that. So again, I think all of the stuff that's in your toolkit that you might use for working with service users can come into play here. We just have to refashion them for a learning environment.
And the other good thing about doing that as well is it role models how we can then engage with other people as well. So the people that we serve in our communities. So that's really important.
There is no guarantee it's going to work though. And it might just be an open conversation about this is what this conversation needs to be about. How can I help you engage more?
Absolutely. Okay, so providing specific examples of both strengths and areas of development. Okay. Absolutely. And I think actually it's really important when we're engaging with giving constructive feedback. It's not just looking at the areas of development and the positive thing. It is looking at both of those things. And it can be difficult sometimes, especially if you've got a student or a supervisor who's particularly anxious or worried. For people like me, I'll want to try and, plump them up and make them feel so much better. And that is important, but it's how we do it. It's an important thing is always, you can get there, you can master this. Together, we'll help you work together. You haven't got it yet, but you can engage and we can get there. And it's really important to have those conversations about, okay, we might not be there yet, but we will be, and this will be okay. So it's setting that understanding that learning about social work and the complicated jobs that we do, you don't know like that. It takes time and it's a journey, and that's okay. And then hopefully that helps when we're giving the feedback of areas of development. It can feel more able to be accepted because it's more about the process, not about the person. and the complexities of social work.
So I appreciate time at the moment
Yes.
is a challenge for us all. So I am going to ask our colleagues to come across and start their presentation. However, what I would also like to say, because I've been reflecting whilst listening to Louise, is that I'm going to use this Padlet to reflect on. I think there's some amazing examples of good, helpful feedback here, which I might take into my teaching. So I'm going to put this as part of my CPD for this year, because I think it's brilliant. And we'll share it on the website for you so everybody else can do the same if you find it useful. Come and introduce yourselves first, and then I'll share the screen.
So, very good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We've done a brief bit of introduction already this morning. So I'm Tilia, and then here's my colleague.
Morning, I'm Ros. So we'll introduce ourselves as we go through.
So we're going to talk to you about applying the lens of attachment theory onto the practice educator and student relationship, and how we can fine-tune feedback. And I'm going to share some of my research and some of the reading I've done over the years. I've been a qualified social worker and practice educator, and worked for about 15 years in frontline practice in child protection services mostly. I've done my master's in leading and developing services. I'm now here at BU and undertake my PhD in what I call relationship-based performance management. And that has all kind of set me off on a journey on what does relationship actually mean? What do we bring to relationships? What does performance in social services, children's services mean? And how do we use feedback in order to raise performance, if that's the right word? And what does it mean to be in a safe relationship, and how that influences our decision-making? So that's really where I'm coming from.
And where I'm coming from, I suppose, is I work directly with students a lot in practice learning. So I see on a daily basis how they feel and engage with the learning. Now, I know, and I say to all students, learning is not without risk. When you go into practice learning or into social work or any profession, it's not without risk. And there's really good reasons why we have to engage in those feedback conversations in order to develop knowledge, to develop understanding. Now, I work here at the university, and in the past, I've worked as a practitioner in mental health. And it's a real joy to work with students on that learning journey, and certainly as part of my PhD research, looking at using mistakes as a useful tool for learning. And mistakes in social work is often a very dirty word. But the reason we're looking, and we're trying to build on the themes that Orlando and Louise were sharing earlier around fine-tuning feedback. And we understand that the relationship is absolutely key and central to that. And so the position we're taking this morning is actually how can we use that relationship? So picking up some of the themes that were on the Padlet around worries around defensiveness and things like that, we're going to think about how we can encourage and foster really positive behaviours within that relationship from both us as practice educators and from our learners. Because the need to fine-tune feedback is an absolute professional skill. It's not just about performance, as you were saying. It's really about helping the student evaluate their practice. So we're developing those parallel skills. You know, from developing skills and honing skills, it's a process of trial and error. And actually, we need to encourage our students that they shouldn't be afraid to try. This is where innovation comes from. And this, for social work, is absolutely crucial. We know there's not a right and a wrong way to do things, and experience is gained through a variety of ways, both through planned and unexpected outcomes. So we need to be able to sometimes stretch our perspective, so thinking about where somebody else's perspective can help us grow and help us develop an understanding. It's also a critical part of the professional capability framework, thinking about domain 6 skills around critical reflection and analysis. And we need to see that evidence with the student developing that critical thinking mindset. That's what we're aiming for. We're not aiming to create robot practitioners who will go out and just do a job. We're trying to create independent thinking professionals with the ability to think through issues, think through problems, evaluate their practice, and learn through feedback. So we're all about relationship today. We're all about shaping growth, validating, looking at constructive feedback and looking at those messages using the lens of attachment theory. This is where I hand over to Tilia to talk us through some of those things.
Yeah. And I'm just going very slightly off piece, because there was a comment in the chat earlier about observing the non-verbal communication between Lou and Orlando. So what would be really interesting for us, because we're in this moment, but we are doing the non-verbal communication very clearly, that gives feedback. We give a smile and reassure, and then I can see the from the other person. But if you could pick that up, how it looks from your point of view as observers, that would be really helpful, because you're in that privileged position where you are essentially observing us. So please give us that feedback if you can, because that's fine-tuning for us, essentially.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I would like to take you on a bit of a journey, because we're all working, or well, most of us are working in statutory services. Some of you may be in the voluntary sector or the third sector, but we all work in a organizational culture. And what my personal experience and my reading has shown is that we are often in organizational cultures where blame is an undercurrent, at least. I take cultures of blame further and look at the socioeconomic background, the political background. How are we seen as a profession as social workers by the government, for example? And I'm just throwing in the McAllister report that was published last week, and some of the case reviews on the very, very sad child death. So how are we seen as a profession, and how are we taking the criticisms out of those reports? We're working in a profession where we are experiencing trauma ourselves, where we are hearing the really difficult stories and narratives of the people that we work with. We're exposed to vicarious trauma. And we also bring our own attachment styles. How have we been brought up? What is our sense of self and the world? How do we expect people to communicate with us and relate to us? So what we're going to talk about in our slides has to be seen in this wider context that sometimes we're actually not able to influence, or certainly won't be able to control. So part of my reading really got me deep into the notion of performance and how we give feedback around performance, how we feel blamed sometimes, how that starts to give us a notion of shame at times, and how that's really not productive for our learning, for our development, because we are then in that panic zone that Orlando and Lou referred to earlier. I was really, really drawn to a quote from James, that social work requires a capacity for love in all its infinite forms, the acceptance of humans as unique individuals that may require a truly creative relationship to overcome the rigid and structural discrimination within society. Now, if we're taking society out and put social work or social services in there, there are structures that discriminate against us in local authority social work in particular. How do we fit in that space in our value-based profession? And that's really where performance comes in, because we have to work towards KPIs, those key performance indicators, and how do they sit with social work? And I went into that quite a lot, and we're going to revisit that. Now, I think you've all heard about Sharon Shoesmith and the baby P effect. And when things go wrong, the profession gets blamed, and there is an element where we want to be accountable, but maybe we haven't got the voice as a profession. So we are given feedback, but we can't necessarily respond to it.
Also, I think it puts people in a very vulnerable position, doesn't it? People feel the vulnerability. And actually, when we feel vulnerable, we're not open to that feedback. We can see it from quite a defensive position.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that links to what Orlando and Lou said earlier about that defensiveness. And are we actually able to listen to feedback and take it on board? Okay. So I think both of us really looked at what makes successful supervision, and we both looked at literature from Bennett, which was well, the research was undertaken in 2008, but still has a lot of relevance for us at the moment. So Bennett looked at what makes successful supervision, and she stated that support, availability, openness, and trust are, in a way, the key pillars of a supervisionary relationship. And that, for me, links very much into attachment theory, and that's why I started to apply attachment theory as a lens to the relationship between practice educator and student, to give us some sort of a framework, because it also relates to the language that we're using in social work. Attachment theory is one of the, well, most guiding principles or most guiding theories that we're applying in our practice. That's where our decision making, certainly in permanency planning, for example, comes from, in children's social care. That's where we're making decisions in adult social care as well, about, well, can we move someone into a care home, or are they actually better placed within the family if that's possible? So looking at what a supportive supervision scenario looks like, I started to use phrases and applied phrases like secure base and supervision. And who can be the secure base? Is it the practice educator? And where does a student come in there when they may feel stressed or blamed or shamed, and their attachment system is activated and they need us as practice educators? Do you have anything to add there? Because you're basing some of your research on the same.
I think it's that foundation of relationship, isn't it? The supervision relationship is one of the key areas where perhaps feedback is delivered. It's sometimes the most intense part of the relationship and the interaction between practice educator and student. So having that secure base, and I think where we're coming from this morning is thinking about what are the necessary foundations that we need to put in place in order to create the best possible chance of a secure base within that relationship. We know supervision can be, and I'm sure if I ask you to cast your mind back to supervision over your professional career, you've had the good, the bad, and the ugly experiences, and those experiences can be quite damaging. They can certainly feed into future experiences and how we perceive and how we experience supervision, all those relationships where we've maybe placed our trust in somebody and that relationship hasn't worked in some way. So the things around defensiveness, the things around availability, the things around feeling someone hasn't got your back and you haven't got that secure base when you've needed it. Because I think what we tend to forget is when we're doing a job within an organisation, there is a lot of emphasis on performance, but actually the experience and the human experience of working with people, the unpredictability, tolerating the uncertainty, can actually leave a learner in a very vulnerable place. It can also leave a practice educator in a vulnerable place, not knowing necessarily how to help the learner in that moment, or not feeling able to acknowledge it with the honesty that's needed in that relationship. And I think that we start to see a very complex web of elements there within that relationship, of actually what we're going to try and do is boil that down to attachment, or what you've been calling the proximity seeking, that kind of the safe, secure base.
Yeah. And it's probably worth mentioning that there is a notion of having a relationship-specific attachment. Mm-hmm. So when you shared the example of having maybe had not so positive experiences in relationships with your supervisors, or maybe even with past students, there is a chance for each relationship to have its own attachment between the two or three or four people. So we're not just taking on the attachment style as a practice educator that we've developed and applied to the next relationship. There is a space where we can actually work on that attachment, and I guess that's where really reflective practice comes from. Who are we in that moment? Okay, so this is looking at shared goals and creating a working alliance with our students. And that possibly could be that starting point of that relationship, of that attachment. and Borden, nearly 40 years ago, stressed that the approach should be around feeling of liking, caring, and trusting. And again, those are probably the words that you would find in attachment literature and can be applied. So a shared goal, social work values rather than KPIs may be something that we can work on to then apply it in the future on performance. How do we relate to each other? What is our shared goal? Is it creating the best service delivery for the people that we serve? And how can we do that?
It reminds me of what we call the tripod of work: the tasking, trusting, tending, and how easily that can flip into the mistrusting, policing element of sort of the dysfunctional element of that, and how critical it is to retain those things. Now, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking the caring, the trusting. Sometimes the liking isn't always present. And I know in a lot of student relationships and practice educator conversations I've had with people, there's sometimes a kind of, it has to be a will to get through and work with the relationship rather than actually liking each other. And I think it's a very difficult position to be in, particularly when you have that shared goal of actually wanting the student to succeed, but the relationship may not have gelled in that way. Sometimes that can be quite difficult. So the caring and trusting part, absolutely. Sometimes we don't always get the liking part.
No.
and that can be mutual, and that can be a barrier in the relationship. And sometimes think about some of the things on the Padlet where the defensiveness may come in, where we have those kind of, I suppose, transference feelings around the other person.
And that probably leads us very nicely onto this next slide. So I've looked at attachment across the lifespan and taken that into the context of the practice placement for today. Now, what I've come across is quite a bit of critique on attachment theory, but also a lot of different terminologies that seem to have changed over the years and seem to have changed depending on where researchers were placed. So we may have terminology around care seeking or proximity seeking, and seeking closeness. I don't necessarily need your care, but I may just want to be close to you because that makes me feel safer. You may want to refer to a safe haven. I would probably refer more to a secure base rather than a safe haven, because the terminology for me doesn't fit quite right. And that may well be my cultural background. And what I've realized is that the safe haven was referred far more to in literature from the US. But what we have at the end of the day is the defining of a new professional self. Our students are on a journey across social work. In social work, they're learning about themselves. They are probably realizing that they have some triggers, that they have some biases, that you as a PE are maybe tickling or pressing or prodding to bring them out and give feedback about it and work through reflective practice with the student to address them. And then they can explore themselves, but also their impact on service users, patients, whoever they're working with. And I'm just bringing in Feeney and Collins there, who said that focused and productive exploratory activity is presumed to occur only when the individual does not question security and availability, which essentially means that if you're not feeling safe and you're not feeling that your PE has your back, you're not able to explore, you're not able to go into those really deep or maybe difficult places of practice to develop yourself.
just thinking of the proximity seeking we were all seeking this morning with the IT professionals around the start of this webinar, and how actually that vulnerability can really prompt us to change our behaviour in some way. Certainly when we are in that position of vulnerability, and our cues are different, we respond differently. Actually noticing some of those things is really crucial to that relationship on both sides.
Absolutely. So, moving on then, we wanted to introduce you to a little model that we've developed. And we're taking the PE and student relationship in this little model and looking at attachment behavior in this. So we've got the challenge in practice that happens to all of us. That can be an IT problem, not being able to log on, for example, and our attachment behaviors are activated. We're getting a bit stressed because we need to know where that address is, where we need to go, and for that we need to log on to the system. So we're seeking proximity to our PE because they're also going to be there, hopefully, during the observation or during the introduction. Maybe emailing them, maybe calling them, maybe they're in the same room with us, and we're hoping that they can help us. And then if you are, as a PE, able to help me out and tell me this is the address where we're going, I see you as a secure base. I think, oh, wow, without Ross, I wouldn't have been able to do this. I can rely on Ross. She is there for me. She helps me. It develops a professional sense of self on one hand, but also my professional sense of that I can rely on Ross. So when the next challenge in practice comes, I will probably feel safe that you are okay, and you're actually not going to judge me that I'm a bit too IT illiterate to log onto my computer. You're not instilling a sense of blame or shame on me, and it's going to be okay. We can work through that. However, there are possibly some parts where that is not the same. And we've got some parts here where Ross will talk to you about maybe where that cycle doesn't work perfectly right.
Sure, absolutely. So there are, Donald Schoen talks about the relationship and the learning relationship being absolutely crucial. And what we know when we do seek proximity, when our defences or our stress systems are activated, we behave in particular ways. And actually this can bring out dangers or ruptures in the relationship. And Donald Schoen talks a lot about those ruptures in relationship and how the practice educator or the educator can respond in a way that's going to be helpful to maintain that secure base, but also I'm going to say not risk rescue responses, because we're trying to support students to develop their own thinking skills. We're trying to support them to resolve problems, think through problems. And our role is to have that proximity, to be close, to support with that task, but not to come in and rescue. And I think Lou mentioned that earlier when talking about the dangers in her own responses, in wanting or seeking to rescue others at a time where they're not okay, and we impulsively want to make somebody feel okay, because there are those of us there that really like to rescue, and we have to watch our responses. So on the model, we've just introduced different areas where there are potential risks and ruptures in that relationship. So potentially where the person or the learner can seek proximity with the PE, but actually that's not validated. It might be an invalidating response, such as, well, don't you know that already? Or you should really know that, you're on week 20 of your placement. And where that proximity, we know that learners experience confidence changes over different things, and we can all be confronted with situations where we have loads of knowledge, we've had experience, but something will knock us off balance. And we seek that proximity to help us feel validated, but also to find that base where we can find those solutions, getting ourselves into a mindset where we're open to possibility. So where it's not reciprocated, where the PE may, for example, invalidate the person's request for help, or I'm too busy, or can't you ask someone else, or can't you think this through yourself, we can sometimes create problems within the relationships, and we have to watch that as practice educators. It can then start to question trust and motivation. We can maybe observe avoidant behaviours or defensiveness in the student, because they're actually seeking safety. They may be in a vulnerable place, not able to think something through, the emotional hijack, those kind of situations, and they're going to be looking for somebody to help them provide the secure base, if not the answer. And actually it's the way we think through those solutions. And of course, we know that can negatively reinforce and impact on future learning situations. So a learner may come away from that interaction and think, well, they didn't support me, they didn't help me resolve the problem, so I won't bother in future. And there is a missed opportunity for feedback and to learn and develop further understanding on new situations. So the reason we've done this is because it is a good way of seeing how the relationship can flow in terms of the seeking proximity with the PE, but also the risks attached with it, and how the relationship can very easily tip into different responses where we're looking at distrust, or maybe the feeling of it feeling invalidated by the practice educator, and how that relationship then is affected by those feelings. Now, we were talking about internal working models, and that's what we're going to come on to in a moment, thinking about attachment and what we bring. And I guess the position we're coming from here is that we need to be aware of both our own internal working models, but also the student, the psychology of what we bring to the relationship and how that impacts that interaction, and thinking about how that's going to impact how feedback is received and communicated.
And this is where we're looking at, yes, what do we bring to the relationship? And this is probably where I can share just my own little story about how I receive feedback, having done quite a bit of work around it and look at my own internal working models. And I can already feel my hands getting sweaty just talking about it, because what I've realized is that my internal working model isn't a particularly positive one. There's probably a reason why I'm a social worker, but usually my internal working model goes along the lines of, I don't deserve. So if someone gives me positive feedback, I actually have a physical stress response because it's not fitting in with my blueprint, with my internal working model. Someone must be wrong to give me positive feedback. It doesn't compute with me at all, and I get sweaty hands and I can't actually hear it because I can only hear the blood rushing through my ears. Now, being quite aware that that's not a very healthy stress response, or a generally healthy response to receiving positive feedback, I've now asked people who are in a position to give me feedback to put it in writing. And then I can sit somewhere quietly and work through that. But it is quite a bit of a challenge. And it's taken me on a journey. So what we would like to ask you to do is look at how you can see if someone may have a secure, insecure attachment. And I'm hoping that our colleagues are just putting in the link to the Padlet in the chat, and you can start writing around there and share your thoughts. Now, coming back to the notion that as PEs we have our own attachment style, we have our general attachment styles, and then those specific to relationships, as we said. So that may be our romantic partner, that may be our children, that may be our friends, our colleagues, and we have that attachment with our students. So in that professional context, we're also influenced by the organizational attachment that we have. Do I feel attached to my employer? Do I feel safe in my employment? Am I on a locum contract, on a temporary contract? Am I maybe in a precarious position where my job is linked to some funding that could be taken away at any time? So that will influence our organisational attachment.
Absolutely. So what we're going to invite you to do is think about your own experiences, both as practice educators and maybe as learners, and think about the areas of insecure and secure attachment and what the behaviours look like. Can you identify and think about what secure attachment behaviours might look like within yourself or your student? So what do you do? What do you think? How do you feel when you feel you have that safe base? And on the flip side, thinking about actually what do you see, what do you experience, how does your behaviour change when you don't have that secure base? So when you have maybe an insecure attachment. So maybe taking a minute to reflect on previous supervision relationships or relationships you've had with students or where you've been a learner yourself, and think about those behaviours and what they look like. So hopefully everyone can pop some comments into the Padlet for us, and we will bring that up with Orlando's help.
And you can see that we are all relying on.
Okay, that's lovely. So we're looking for clues in the relationship. So using your own experience, thinking about what those responses might be. It might be words, it might be emotions that you experience, or observations you've made from students that you've worked with.
Yeah, and it may well be the non-verbal communication. If a student isn't responding to you, isn't coming back to you, is literally turning their back on you and avoiding you, if you're in a physical shared space. If you are in an online environment, how could that look like?
Okay.
So we've got some avoiding eye contact.
Yes.
Orlando is currently avoiding eye contact with me because she clearly doesn't want to help us with the IT problems anymore. Short answers. Absolutely. So that probably links in with the comment that we had in the chat earlier about how do we encourage our students to not just have them I'm lost for words.
That's fine. I was going to ask actually, because we've got lots of comments on the insecure attachment. So these are behaviours that you've either personally experienced or observed in others. And I guess it's that thing of how have you dealt with those in that moment? How have you, when you've encountered a student with very closed body language, do you use immediacy to actually identify that in that moment? Or make observations of, you know, for example, I've noticed that I've said this to you and your body language has completely changed. Are you able to tell me about that? So we've got a comment, previously had a student who was completely avoidant of everything, including phones and emails, physically turn. Okay. Yeah.
I really like one of the comments which shared about being motivated and open up and reflect upon experiences. And someone used the word adventure, because I guess in a way for our students, it is an adventure. It is really exciting. It puts us in that stretched zone. Adventure may also go into panic, but it's a term that I really like and probably will take forward to use. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, saying things are okay when clearly it isn't.
It's very British, isn't it? How are you? Fine.
Fine, thank you. But we can pick up those cues, and it is about, you know, how have you dealt with that in that moment, and actually identifying that incongruence. On the other side, somebody has put congruence, and I think that's a really important thing. Is what you're seeing congruent to what you're hearing? And actually, how do we identify that? Do we do in a quite direct way to really help expand the learner's understanding? I always remember share a little story, just looking at the time before I meander, sharing a little story with a student who came in, and I'd seen her face, her body, shoulders, everything tensed up, and it looked really angry. And I asked her how she was, and she said, "I'm fine." And I thought, okay, let's unpick this because clearly you're not. And it was about picking the moment in that moment. So at the moment she'd done it, I couldn't do it, but actually the earliest opportunity I was able to have that conversation, because in that moment that person couldn't see. Now I saw a great thing last night that talked about in boiling water you can't see the bottom of the pan because it's bubbling furiously. You have to wait for the water to settle to gain that clarity. And for this particular student, I had to do that because the water was so bubbly. So we waited for the waters to calm, and I told her, I'm getting looks from Lou for telling you all a story. And she okay. With this particular student, it was about picking the moment, actually, I really need to give you some feedback. I want to tell you this because I want you to understand and grow with it, not to see this as a criticism. I wanted to comment on the observation. I saw you having an interaction with someone else and I saw you becoming angry and you weren't able to disguise that. And are you aware that when you become angry, this happens to your body? And the student was completely unaware of that. They had no awareness of the physical response that occurred when they felt angry in that way. And actually, although it was a difficult and uncomfortable conversation, it was really helpful for that person's growth. They went away understanding more about themselves, an area where they hadn't necessarily had that awareness. So I'm going to come back to the Padlet rather than distract you all with my meandering and look at maybe some secure. So the things that we're looking at with secure, and we put the picture of the woman on the swing because goodness knows I would feel very insecure at a height hanging on a string.
I'll be more with a cat.
So we're looking at a lot different. So willingness to explore. So this is openness, aren't we? Transparency, clear and confident communication, reflecting upon experiences. They're feeling happy and comfortable and can discuss anything with you. So the honesty, we're seeing that theme of a student will feel able to be honest. So if we're not seeing those things, what is the barrier? How do we think about that as a PE, and how do we actually tackle that? So eye contact, yes, noticing eye contact, noticing a dialogue, a two-way conversation, an eagerness and a confidence to take on new challenges. Absolutely. And I think also openness about exploring feelings and emotions. And I know sometimes emotions can be a dirty word in social work and sometimes a difficult topic for some students. I've had students say to me, don't ask me about emotions, I won't reflect. and it's a challenge for me. Then the gauntlet is laid down because actually if we don't feel, we aren't empathic in practice and we can't be effective communicators and build human relationships. And goodness knows that is what social work is built on. So spending time at the start of a session about how they are on a personal level, being interested in them as a person. Absolutely. Core relationship skills, core relationship building skills, exactly what we've been talking about.
Okay. I think that sums it up really nicely. And there's been the insecure attachment bit is a lot of avoidance, and I'm just going to pick up one, blame others.
Okay.
And that's coming out quite clearly in the literature that if we're feeling insecure when we maybe are angry or anxious, we will blame others. It's really difficult to then reflect and hear feedback, take it on board. Other than that, it's just marinating us in despair further. Okay.
Marinating us in despair. Absolutely, okay. Yolanda, if you could switch the screen.
Brilliant. Or are they getting... Yes,
okay. Fantastic. So I just thought I'd share a really quick story, if I'm allowed. I've had a student who was really anxious in an observed piece of practice. And what I realised is that she had pulled her long sleeves over her hands. And it was a supervision session with a foster carer. And she was, in a fostering service. The foster carers really picked up on it. When she tried to challenge them, she pulled on her sleeves all the time, trying to hide herself, essentially. We've had the opportunity to really unpick that because we had a probably really positive and secure relationship at that time. And she had been totally unaware, a bit like your student, about being angry. She hadn't been aware that her anxiety, her not feeling that confident in practice yet, and as a student you don't need to be, was very much represented in her behaviours. And she then took a very solution-focused way and was only wearing short-sleeved or three-quarter sleeves. So she stopped herself from pulling over those sleeves over her hands. And that changed her whole body language. But without that conversation, she wouldn't have been able to grow as a practitioner in that sense and really develop her professional self.
there's a really key difference in how feedback is given. And that's a really good example. Thinking about actually, if somebody said, don't pull your sleeves over your hands, it makes you look anxious. Actually taking the time to have that conversation helps the learner understand why that is, and then actually they sort their own solution to manage that. And having that awareness and having that opportunity to have the conversation of, are you aware you do this when you look anxious? Yeah. Is actually a window into their awareness. And we're developing student self-awareness, which again is such a critical skill. So not only evaluating their practice, but developing the self-awareness at the same time. Mm. And I think for many practice educators, and seeing some of the comments in the Padlet earlier, we're afraid to touch on feedback. We're afraid to point out those things. We're afraid sometimes to use immediacy in the relationship and saying, are you aware you've done this? Or when you said that, the conversation changed. We're sometimes aware to tackle those difficult issues because a student can appear defensive, or because we may not have the confidence in our own abilities to manage the response we get to that feedback.
I guess that comes back to the point we wanted to make, that as PEs, we have to be responsive to our students. So picking the right moment, as you said, waiting for the water not to be at boiling point anymore.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to move on to think about a couple of things, really, looking at the cues of attachment in the student, the things that we've identified there, and also thinking about that in the context of how we can foster a growth mindset. Now, the work I've done around mistakes has been looking a lot at how students can feel very vulnerable in that learning relationship, and how learning is a very risky process. It's also a very sensory process. And to make sense of the things that we experience, we both observe, we hear, we feel things. It's a very sensory thing. So sometimes that can overload us in the same way as situations and environments and cultures can overload us and make us feel quite vulnerable. So we're thinking about actually looking at reading the cues of attachment in the student. And I can see from the comments that we're getting in the Padlet that you're very aware. And I've just asked you all the question about how do you address that in the relationship with your student? Are you honest about those observations? And do you take the time to actually explore some of those things when we pick up those cues from the relationship? Now, when we know somebody has a secure base within the relationship, things work well, we know that they have the capacity to explore and develop their professional self. So the knowledge they gain helps them create new understanding. And if we think about the concept of transformative learning, where we have to go and work through those experiences in order to develop that understanding, that may well involve making mistakes. It may well involve a bit of trial and error, a bit of experimentation. But what we know is actually some rather marvellous things can be created from those opportunities, from that creative thinking, from that different headspace. When we're in a fearful headspace where we're driven by the urge to do those kind of, not in the creative open thinking spaces that we have when we feel safe, we know that our decision making is really shut down. We know that we look for the right way to do it and not what are the ways in which I could approach this, taking a much more open approach. So we know when there's a secure base, what we're going to give the student is the opportunity for creative thinking, for them to build the ability to challenge both our professional opinions and test out their own. We're going to be creating the ability, to think about hypothesizing rather than tell me the answer. So we're creating that base for a critical thinking professional. Now, working with and giving feedback is something not just we do verbally, we're saying we do this non-verbally as well. And so there are opportunities, not just in the formal supervision setting, but in the relationship we have with them generally and our demeanour with that student. And we can see with the insecure, if we have that insecure base, if the student doesn't feel safe as such, that they can either be too dependent or too distanced. And maybe thinking about the relationship you have with your student, if you have a student at the moment, what have you seen within that relationship? And can you think of times where you've seen some of those changes in their behaviour. So we know that students will work on a very surface level rather than a deep level when they feel insecure, that they'll seek concrete explanations, they'll fear mistakes, and they'll perceive feedback as criticism, and will see those defensive behaviours. Now, what we're seeing then is the risk of actually the student not being able to engage in the learning in a really meaningful way. And ultimately, practice learning is about enabling the student to engage in that learning. We're not teaching them to do a job, we're enabling them to create the thinking skills and the intellectual skills to deal with complexities of social work. Now, confidence is something I would say to students, I feel much more confident if. And I say, well, that's a very false measure, because confidence is something that comes and goes. What we try and aim to do is build knowledge and build understanding. Confidence is something that will come and go for the most experienced of professionals. And for all of you watching today, you will have moments where you don't feel confident. And that spectrum of dependence and autonomy is something that we move along. We don't stay in a fixed position. And this moves us on to starting to think about actually the concept of a growth mindset. So I'm just going to move on to this. Now, I've used, actually, it's a picture of one of my favourite plants, the bleeding heart, Dicentra. But I talk about growth because I think about growth in the garden. When I think about plants, I think about nature, I think about nurture. And our role as practice educators is about nurture. We all have our ways of thinking and our ways of approaching practice. And I think it takes a good deal of self-awareness and self-reflection to arrive at that place where we start to think about, how do I function as a professional? What are the key things? Think about the internal working models that we were thinking about. And my personal internal working model is always, I am not enough. So we all have those things that we bring to that relationship. So my risk is always about not enabling the student to take positive risks, which is part of a necessary part of their learning, because I may fear the outcome. So I have to kind of watch that. So we think about giving and receiving feedback, and I want to challenge you all thinking about, what is your own mindset? Now, I've been really interested in reading the work of Carol Dweck, and there's an article cited here where they've evaluated they've worked with a number of people and studies to look at how we pass on a growth mindset to children. Now, just to give you a bit of background, growth mindset and fixed mindset is something you will probably hear about when we think about compulsory education and children. Now, as we all know, children become adults, and the lessons we learn in childhood shape how we engage as adult learners. And that is really interesting to me, because I think those internal working models are shaped from a long time back. And the attachment styles we have, the proximity we seek, what is considered safe to us is learned at a very young age. And we take that through. So the learner we have in front of us, who's an adult, was once a child. And how they have learned and engaged in education and learning in their lifetime and experience is very much going to be based on a biography of experience. And that's really fascinating. I mean, for me, looking at mistakes and how we learn, it's been about how people conceptualize and think about mistakes, or what are the key pivotal experiences in their lifetime that have really shaped how they've experienced mistakes. So we're looking at growth mindset and fixed mindsets as really the kind of precursors to attachment styles, I guess, looking at the secure and insecure. Because we can look at sort of, if we transpose the ideas, how we need to encourage a growth mindset within our students, and how feedback is such a central and productive part of that conversation. So we know that experience can be either productive or undermining, and the feedback that we give can be really pivotal to that uptake of learning. So when we're giving that feedback, we're thinking about, how can I do this in a way that ensures growth for the learner? That it's not about giving feedback that this is wrong. It's about, this is a growth conversation. This is a conversation that's going to help you grow, stretch. And we're actually doing this with the safety harness on. So the characteristics of growth and fixed mindsets I've put on the slide here, and we can see that the fixed mindset is very congruent with the insecure attachment, that we're thinking there's only one way to do things. There's a right or wrong dichotomy. Now for social work, that's very often not the case unless we're thinking about how do I input something on care director or a case management system. There is often a right and a wrong way to do it, but we can always find those kind of swerves around the edge to try and make it work. But in social work, when we're working with people, there's no right and wrong. There is just the way that is most effective. We see in a fixed mindset that intelligence and ability are seen as fixed traits that can't be improved or changed. Now, how many students have you had that said, I'm not really academic? I'm not an academic. I'm at university, but I'm not really here. And as an academic, my skills aren't very good. Well, those are characteristics of fixed mindset. If it's a very person-focused feedback, that it can engender criticism. So if it's felt personally about you, you did this wrong, it's very personal and it links to that in person's internal working model rather than depersonalizing it and making it about the choice, the process, the strategy that person chose to engage in. So separating behavior from the person. And seeing also the possibility of failure it can't be tolerated, and then it discourages that person then from exploring and option seeking. So what we're aiming for here is a growth mindset. As a practice educator, we're trying to instill a growth mindset with our student, but also thinking about ourselves and the culture of the organisation we're working with. So our team, the language we use, how we introduce that into the work that we do. So we can focus on very process-focused feedback. So focusing on the strategy adopted, not the outcome. So we're not just looking for the right answer. We're looking, how did you decide to approach the issue in that way? What was the reason for that choice at that moment? Help me understand what you were thinking at that moment when you tried this. And sort of thinking about the process rather than, you did this wrong and this happened at this point. Why did you do that? It's very blaming. So there's something very much in the language that we can do that helps a student learn the language of evaluation. We can question, so what can you learn from this experience? So it didn't go right this time. What can we learn from this? How would you approach this differently in future? And seeing failure as or a setback as an expected part of learning. So we're normalizing this, and that we're leading this by example, that we're showing this through our own practice, that this is part of our own growth, and that we're still on that continued journey. Okay.
I heard a lovely phrase last week, which went along the lines of, I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right. And that stuck with me because that's very much what social work is about, that we want to get it right. And right may mean something very different to the individual that we're working with at the time, be it our clients, our service users, our colleagues, or our students.
Absolutely. Now, if you want to put some comments in the chat, we do have some time for questions at the end, and I'll just do a quick sum up and we'll offer some concluding thoughts, because it's been, although we prepare things, we've all ad-libbed a bit this morning. I particularly want to thank Louise and Orlando for their conversation, because I think that was a really brave thing to do and to be willing to do. And it was certainly something I wasn't willing to do.
It's a very vulnerable place to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you have questions and comments you want to put in the chat based on some of the things that we're talking about, what we can say is that the references we're using, the things, the interesting stuff around growth mindset, which I think as practice educators should really fascinate you. It's such an interesting concept. All of the references we are providing in the slides, and we will provide that information to you at the end. If you do have any questions you'd like to share, then we can do that. Okay. I'm just going to stand a little closer to the microphone. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So to sum up, what we really wanted to think about is, actually as adult learners, knowledge development is not about an expert, so the practice educator depositing knowledge to a novice like a transactional banking. And this draws on the ideas of Paulo Freire, looking at the concept of education. We're educating adults, we're educating them into ways of thinking and ways of practicing that leads them to develop an artistry of practice of their own. So we're not there to teach the right way or the way to do it, the way to solve it. We're there to teach the way to think through an issue or a problem. So we're using feedback as a tool for knowledge development and awareness development, because we know feedback is not just going to be about increasing their concrete knowledge, it's also going to be increasing their self-evaluation skills and hopefully their self-awareness, which we know are critical elements of developing a professional identity. Now, feedback needs to be a dialogue about development and about growth. And I heard one of my students saying in a setting that they'd worked with, that they had a conversation with the teenager and said, this is about growth. I want to have a conversation with you about growth. Because it really directly said, this is not going to be about criticism, this is about learning. I'm going to have a conversation with you that's going to help you learn, I hope, or my intention is this. So it enables the learner to evaluate their practice. So the feedback we're giving invites their feedback and their perception. We're inviting a conversation. We're not just saying, this is what I've noticed and I am right. The person may disagree, and actually we want to encourage that. We want to have a conversation and reflect on their perception of the situation, understand their evaluation. So we know, and one of our things today is really been saying practice educator is really key as a leader and demonstrating leadership around this, because the student may not know these things. They are on a journey of development, but also actually breaking down that power balance within the relationship can be really powerful in terms of saying, I'm also on a learning journey. I welcome your feedback. There is something around reciprocal feedback that really helps a person hear and know that they're going to be heard in a very safe space. And constructive feedback, it contributes to reposition how learning is experienced. So we know learning is a risk. We know it can be beneficial, risk can be beneficial, and the need to learn to tolerate feelings of uncertainty and discomfort are actually really, really crucial to you as a professional. So how we can do that in a safe space within supervision will help them in practice when they're encountering a very hostile situation perhaps, or where they need to manage themselves in a really boundaried way. It's also how innovation can be fostered, and this is absolutely part of what we need to be doing as a profession, fostering innovation, fostering creativity, thinking about how the learner is able to step outside of their comfort zone and to do that in a way with confidence, to know that the person there listening to them is able to both support but also give them developmental feedback. And I'm going to end there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Take care. And thank you to my colleagues.